January 13th, 1939, San Francisco Bay. In the darkness before dawn, a heavy fog surrounded a small island just over a mile from the California shoreline. The island was called Alcatraz. To the people who ran it, Alcatraz represented something new in American corrections. It was a prison designed for men who had caused trouble elsewhere, men considered dangerous, men considered difficult to control, and, perhaps most importantly, men considered likely to escape. The geography alone seemed to provide the perfect barrier. Beyond the walls of the prison lay the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. Strong currents moved through the darkness, and on this particular January morning, fog obscured much of what lay beyond the island, inside the prison. Most of the inmates remained locked in their cells, but 5 men had other plans. They had been preparing quietly, waiting, watching, and sometime during the early morning hours, they made their move. Among them was a prisoner approaching 40 years old. His name was Arthur Barker, but throughout much of the criminal underworld, he was better known by another name, Doc. Years earlier, Arthur Barker had been part of one of the most notorious criminal organizations of the Great Depression. He had been associated with Alvin Karpis, with his brother Fred, and, inevitably, with the woman history would remember as Ma Barker. Arthur had survived arrests, prisons, a nationwide federal investigation, and the collapse of the gang with which his name had become permanently associated. Now, he was confined inside the institution that was supposed to end any possibility of escape. But Arthur Barker was going to try anyway. The 5 prisoners managed to get out of the cell house. Beyond it, freedom appeared tantalizingly close. Across the water were the lights of the San Francisco Bay Area, but between the prisoners and those lights stood the final barriers of Alcatraz, the shoreline, the guards, and the bay itself. What happened that morning would become one of the early escape stories in the history of America's most famous prison. But Arthur Barker's journey to Alcatraz had begun decades earlier, more than 1,500 miles away, in a family whose name would eventually become synonymous with the gangster era. To understand how Arthur Barker ended up here, we need to return to the beginning. Arthur Barker was born in 1899. At the time, the America into which he was born looked very different from the country he would come to know as an adult. Automobiles were still uncommon. Commercial radio did not yet exist. Airplanes had not yet taken flight. And the federal law enforcement organization that would eventually devote enormous resources to pursuing Arthur and his associates had not even been created. Arthur was one of the children of George and Kate Barker. Kate would eventually become far more famous than almost anyone else in the family. History would remember her as Ma Barker. But that image belonged to the future, before newspaper stories, before federal agents, before the Barker-Karpis Gang. There was simply a family. George and Kate Barker had 4 sons who survived into adulthood: Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, and Fred. Over time, all 4 would encounter serious trouble with the law, and as the brothers grew older, the distinction between the Barker household and the criminal world surrounding it became increasingly difficult to separate. Arthur's path toward that world began relatively early, like several of his brothers. He accumulated a criminal record long before the Barker name became nationally famous. These were not yet the spectacular crimes that would eventually attract federal investigators. There were no enormous ransom demands, no nationwide manhunts, no famous hideouts. Instead, there was a gradual progression: trouble with authorities, property crimes, arrests, periods of imprisonment, release, and then more trouble. It is tempting, when looking backward at someone's life, to imagine that the ending was inevitable, that the young Arthur Barker was somehow destined to become the man later imprisoned at Alcatraz. But history rarely works that neatly. America itself was changing around him. The first decades of the 20th century brought enormous social and technological transformation. Cars made it possible to travel farther and faster. Highways gradually connected communities, cities expanded, and criminals discovered that the same technologies transforming ordinary life could also make it easier to operate across jurisdictions. A person could commit a crime in one community, get into an automobile, and reach another jurisdiction before information about the crime had traveled nearly as far. Police departments were overwhelmingly local. Records were not instantly searchable. Photographs and fingerprints had to be physically exchanged. Communication between agencies could be slow, for criminals willing to move constantly. Those limitations created opportunities. Arthur Barker would eventually become part of a generation of criminals who exploited them. But before that happened, prison became a recurring feature of his life, and prison would prove important for another reason. It was where criminal relationships could form. Men met one another. They exchanged stories. They learned reputations. They discovered who could be trusted and who could not. These relationships sometimes continued after release. By the beginning of the 1930s, America was entering one of the most famous periods in its criminal history. The Great Depression had devastated communities across the country. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared. At the same time, a relatively small collection of criminals began appearing repeatedly in newspaper headlines: John Dillinger, George Machine Gun Kelly, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, and eventually Alvin Karpis and the Barker brothers. Their crimes were very real, but the newspapers transformed many of these figures into something larger. They became characters in an ongoing national drama. Each robbery produced headlines. Each escape generated another story. Each encounter with authorities added to the mythology, and improved roads and increasingly powerful automobiles allowed criminals to move between states with a speed earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. Law enforcement was changing as well. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was acquiring greater capabilities and would soon become central to the campaign against interstate criminals. The balance was beginning to shift, but neither side fully understood yet how dramatically that transformation would reshape American policing. Arthur Barker stood directly in the middle of that changing world. By this point, his younger brother Fred was also deeply involved in crime, and another man was about to become extraordinarily important to the Barker story. His name was Alvin Karpis. Karpis was Canadian-born. He had also spent time behind bars, and after escaping custody in 1930, he became increasingly involved with members of the Barker family. The partnership that developed between Karpis and Fred Barker would eventually form the core of what became known as the Barker-Karpis Gang. Arthur would become part of that criminal network as well. The group would not remain a simple collection of thieves. Their activities would escalate: bank robberies, interstate crime, and eventually kidnapping for ransom. Those kidnappings would transform everything. They would bring unprecedented federal attention. They would help advance new forensic techniques. They would contribute to the destruction of the gang, and they would ultimately help send Arthur Barker to an island in San Francisco Bay. But in the early 1930s, none of that had happened yet. For the moment, Arthur Barker was simply one member of a criminal family moving deeper into an increasingly dangerous world. His mother's name was not yet legendary. Alvin Karpis had not yet become one of America's most hunted fugitives, and the Barker-Karpis Gang had not yet committed the crimes for which it would become infamous. That was about to change, because in June of 1933, a wealthy businessman would leave his office in St. Paul, Minnesota. His name was William Hamm, and his disappearance would begin a chain of events that would eventually lead investigators directly to Arthur "Doc" Barker. Long before Arthur Barker became a member of one of the most notorious gangs of the Depression era, he had already spent years moving in and out of the criminal justice system. And to understand the man who would eventually arrive at Alcatraz, we need to spend some time with those earlier years, because Arthur's criminal career did not begin with kidnapping. It developed gradually, one arrest at a time, one prison sentence at a time, and one increasingly serious crime at a time. Arthur Barker grew up alongside three brothers whose lives would also become entangled with the law: Herman, Lloyd, and Fred. The Barker brothers came of age during a period when the American Midwest was changing rapidly. Automobiles were transforming travel. Cities were expanding, and communities that had once seemed distant from one another were becoming increasingly connected. For young criminals, those changes created opportunities. According to later federal accounts, the Barker brothers began attracting police attention while they were still relatively young. Arthur's criminal record stretched back into the 1910s. By the following decade, his encounters with authorities had become considerably more serious. He was arrested for crimes including burglary and robbery, and increasingly, Arthur found himself behind bars. Prison sentences interrupted his life repeatedly, but they did not end his involvement in crime. Instead, a pattern developed. Arthur would be imprisoned, eventually released, and before long, he would find himself involved in criminal activity again. It was a cycle that would continue for years. Arthur acquired the nickname Doc. The name would follow him throughout his criminal career. Eventually, newspaper reports and law enforcement records would refer to him simply as Doc Barker. But there was nothing particularly glamorous about the life behind that nickname. For much of the 1920s, Arthur's world consisted of arrests, courtrooms, prisons, and associations with other criminals. His brothers were following similar paths. Herman Barker became involved in robbery and other crimes. Lloyd Barker accumulated his own criminal record, and Fred, the youngest of the four, would eventually become Arthur's most infamous brother. Kate Barker remained closely connected to her sons throughout these years. Later accounts would portray her in dramatically different ways. Some described a mother who defended her children regardless of what they did. Others transformed her into the calculating leader of a criminal family. As we discussed in our previous episode, the evidence for that second portrayal remains disputed, but there is little question that Kate remained extraordinarily loyal to her sons, and that loyalty would eventually place her in close proximity to some extremely dangerous people. Arthur's criminal career took a particularly important turn in the 1920s. In 1922, he was convicted in Oklahoma for his involvement in a killing during a burglary. Arthur received a life sentence. For many people, that would have been the end of the story. A young man in his early 20s, convicted of a serious crime, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. But Arthur Barker would not spend the rest of his life there. Years passed. Outside the prison walls, America changed dramatically. The prosperous years of the 1920s came and went. Then, in October of 1929, the stock market collapsed. Businesses failed. Banks closed. Unemployment spread across the country. The Great Depression had begun. And while Arthur remained incarcerated, a new generation of criminals was beginning to emerge. They would become famous for something earlier criminals had rarely possessed: mobility. The automobile had changed crime. A bank robber no longer needed to disappear into the alleys surrounding the scene. He could disappear into another county, another state, sometimes another part of the country. Police departments still operated largely within local jurisdictions. A sheriff in one county might know almost nothing about a suspect wanted 2 states away. Fingerprints existed, but there was no computerized database. Photographs could be distributed, but doing so took time. Radio communication was improving, but it was nowhere near universal. Criminals learned to exploit those gaps. They stole powerful automobiles, changed license plates, used aliases, moved between rented houses and tourist cabins, and crossed state lines whenever pressure became too intense. This was the world waiting for Arthur Barker when he eventually returned to freedom in September of 1932. After roughly a decade in prison, Arthur Barker was released. He was now in his early 30s, and almost immediately, he returned to a criminal network that had changed considerably during his absence. His brother Fred was already moving through that world, and Fred had formed an important partnership with a man named Barker-Karpis. Karpis would later become one of the most recognizable criminals of the decade. Born in Canada, he had spent much of his youth in the United States and developed a criminal record of his own. Like Arthur, Karpis understood prison. He understood aliases. He understood the necessity of moving frequently. And perhaps most importantly, he understood organization. Karpis and Fred Barker had met while incarcerated in Kansas. After their release, they began working together. Their partnership proved remarkably durable. Other criminals moved in and out of their circle, but Fred Barker and Barker-Karpis remained at its core. Eventually, Arthur joined them. The organization historians now call the Barker-Karpis Gang was not a gang in quite the way popular culture sometimes portrays one. There was not necessarily a permanent roster of members sitting around a table planning every crime together. Instead, there was a network: trusted associates, safecrackers, drivers, robbers, people who supplied automobiles, people who provided places to hide, and people who could be brought into a particular operation when their skills were needed. That flexibility made the group difficult to pursue. One individual might appear during one robbery, then disappear from the gang's activities for months. Another might provide a house. Another might provide information, and the central figures could move hundreds of miles between crimes. Arthur Barker entered this world with something valuable: experience. He was no longer a teenage offender. He had spent years around criminals. He understood the consequences of being caught, and he had family connections at the heart of the organization. By the early 1930s, the gang was associated with a series of robberies throughout the Midwest. Banks were obvious targets, but bank robbery was dangerous. Local police could respond quickly, witnesses could identify vehicles, and the amount of money available inside a small-town bank was unpredictable. The gang needed planning, they needed speed, and they needed reliable escape routes. A typical operation might begin long before anyone entered the bank. The surrounding roads could be studied. Vehicles could be stolen in advance. Members of the gang could observe when employees arrived, when the streets were busiest, and where law enforcement was located. Afterward, the criminals could abandon one automobile and switch to another. Every additional layer of planning made the investigation more difficult, but every additional participant also created another possible weakness, another witness, another fingerprint, another person who might eventually talk. And investigators were becoming better equipped to exploit those weaknesses. The Bureau of Investigation, the organization that would become the FBI, was expanding its capabilities. Fingerprint identification was becoming increasingly important. Federal agents could connect evidence recovered hundreds of miles apart. Crimes that once appeared unrelated could begin to form a pattern. This was particularly dangerous for criminals like Arthur Barker, because fingerprints do not care about aliases. A man could change his name, change his appearance, move to another state, carry false identification. But if investigators recovered a usable fingerprint, his past could follow him. That fact would eventually become crucial. Arthur had returned to freedom at almost exactly the moment when the Barker-Karpis organization was becoming more ambitious. Robbery had brought money, but there was another crime that promised vastly larger returns: kidnapping. During the early 1930s, kidnapping for ransom became a source of enormous public fear. The 1932 kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's infant son had horrified the nation and helped produce new federal legislation. Under the Federal Kidnapping Act, federal authorities gained an important role when victims were transported across state lines. For criminals, kidnapping could produce a ransom far greater than the proceeds of many bank robberies. But it also brought something else: federal attention. That was the trade-off. A successful kidnapping might produce an extraordinary amount of money, but it could also bring some of the most determined investigators in the country into the case. The Barker-Karpis Gang was about to take that risk. Their target lived in St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Paul occupied a peculiar place in the criminal history of the era. For years, the city had acquired a reputation as a comparatively comfortable refuge for certain criminals, connected to a notorious informal arrangement, sometimes described as the O'Connor system. Under that arrangement, criminals who came to the city could supposedly avoid local interference, provided they obeyed certain unwritten rules. Most importantly, they were expected not to commit crimes within St. Paul itself. Whether every detail of that arrangement functioned exactly as later stories claimed is difficult to establish, but the city's reputation among criminals was very real. Gangsters passed through, hideouts could be found, connections could be made, and wealthy potential targets lived nearby. One of those targets was a businessman named William Hamm Jr. Hamm was president of the Theodore Hamm Brewing Company. His family was prominent. His financial resources were substantial, and his routine could be observed. For a gang considering kidnapping for ransom, he represented exactly the kind of victim who might produce an enormous payment. The plan that followed would elevate the Barker-Karpis Gang into an entirely different category of criminal organization. It would also leave behind evidence investigators would study for years, evidence that would eventually point to Arthur Barker. On June 15, 1933, William Hamm finished his workday. He left the brewery in St. Paul. He expected to make the short journey home. Instead, men were waiting for him within moments. Hamm disappeared, and somewhere in the Midwest, Arthur Doc Barker and his associates were about to become part of one of the most important kidnapping investigations of the gangster era. June 15, 1933, St. Paul, Minnesota, for William Hamm Jr. It began as an ordinary day. By evening, his disappearance would set in motion one of the most important kidnapping investigations of the 1930s and years later. Evidence from the case would help investigators connect Arthur Doc Barker to the Barker-Karpis Gang. William Hamm Jr. was president of the Theodore Hamm Brewing Company. The Hamm family was well known in St. Paul. Their brewery had become one of the city's major businesses, and William's position made him both prominent and wealthy. For kidnappers searching for a victim whose family could afford a substantial ransom, he represented an attractive target. The men who selected Hamm did not simply encounter him by chance. His movements could be observed. His workplace was known, and on June 15th, the kidnappers were waiting. That afternoon, Hamm left the brewery and began walking toward his home. He never made it. A group of men intercepted him. Hamm was forced into an automobile and driven away. What followed was carefully designed to make it difficult for him to determine where he had been taken. He was prevented from seeing his surroundings. The automobile continued for some time, eventually carrying him across state lines. That detail would become enormously important because crossing a state boundary transformed the case from a local kidnapping into a federal matter. The Federal Kidnapping Act had been enacted only the previous year. The law had emerged partly from the national outrage surrounding the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's infant son. Americans wanted authorities to have greater power to pursue kidnappers who could simply move their victims beyond the jurisdiction of local police. For the Barker-Karpis Gang, that meant their plan carried a risk that would not have existed in quite the same way only a few years earlier. They were no longer dealing solely with St. Paul police. Federal investigators could become involved, and federal investigators had access to something that would prove especially dangerous to the gang: a rapidly expanding fingerprint identification system. After his abduction, Hamm was taken to a location in Wisconsin. The kidnappers demanded $100,000. During the Great Depression, that was an extraordinary sum. For comparison, millions of Americans were struggling simply to find work. Families were losing homes. Banks had failed. Savings had disappeared. Yet somewhere in the Midwest, a criminal organization was demanding $100,000 for the safe return of a single man. The amount guaranteed enormous attention. But the kidnappers had another problem. They needed the Hamm family to cooperate without giving authorities enough time to locate them. Communication, therefore, had to be controlled. Instructions were delivered. A ransom note established the demand, and Hamm's family faced the terrifying calculation familiar to families in kidnapping cases: follow the kidnapper's directions or risk making the situation worse. The gang also wanted proof that Hamm would not later claim he had been taken willingly, so they required him to sign ransom notes. This seemingly small decision would become one of the most historically significant aspects of the entire case. Hamm was made to sign several pieces of paper. The kidnappers handled those papers as well, and when the ransom notes eventually reached investigators, the Bureau examined them carefully. At first glance, they were simply pieces of paper carrying instructions and signatures. But investigators suspected they might contain something invisible to the naked eye: fingerprints. The problem was recovering them. Ordinary fingerprint powder worked well on certain surfaces, but paper presented a greater challenge. Fingerprints left behind on porous material could be extremely difficult to reveal. Investigators needed another method, and the Hamm case became an important early demonstration of one. The technique involved silver nitrate. When a person touches paper, tiny traces of perspiration can remain behind. Among the substances present in perspiration are chloride compounds. Silver nitrate can react with those chlorides. With careful treatment and exposure to light, previously invisible fingerprint patterns can become visible. The technique required patience and precision, but when investigators applied it to evidence from the Hamm kidnapping, they obtained something extraordinary: latent fingerprints, prints that the kidnappers apparently had no idea they had left behind. Suddenly, the ransom notes were more than communications. They were evidence. This is where the investigation becomes especially interesting, because the criminals of the 1930s understood many of the weaknesses of law enforcement. They understood jurisdiction. They understood automobiles. They understood aliases. They understood the value of moving frequently. But forensic science was evolving quickly, and a criminal could take elaborate precautions, only to leave behind something as simple as the ridge pattern of a fingertip. Investigators compared the recovered prints with records already held by the Bureau. Some of the men involved in the Barker-Karpis organization had spent considerable time in prison. Their fingerprints already existed in law enforcement files. Eventually, prints recovered from evidence associated with the Hamm kidnapping were linked to members of the gang. Among the identifications investigators would make was Arthur Barker. Doc's years in prison had created the very record that could now help identify him. The system had remembered him, even when witnesses could not, even when aliases changed, even when the gang crossed state lines. His fingerprints remained the same. Meanwhile, the Hamm family prepared the ransom, $100,000. The money had to be delivered according to carefully arranged instructions. For the kidnappers, the exchange represented the most dangerous stage of the operation. Taking a victim could happen quickly. Holding him could be done in an isolated location, but collecting ransom money required someone to appear somewhere. Investigators understood this. Kidnappers understood it too. Every ransom exchange therefore became a contest between surveillance and secrecy. The gang wanted the money without being observed. Authorities wanted the kidnappers without endangering Hamm. And the Hamm family wanted only one thing: William returned safely. The ransom was paid. Shortly afterward, William Hamm was released. He had been held for several days. He returned alive. For his family, the immediate nightmare was over. For investigators, the case was only beginning. The kidnappers had their money, but they had also left evidence behind: the ransom notes, fingerprints, descriptions, movements that could be reconstructed, automobiles that might be traced, associates who could eventually be questioned, and perhaps most importantly, a pattern. Because successful criminals often face a peculiar danger. Success can encourage repetition. The Hamm kidnapping had produced an enormous ransom. The victim had been released. The gang had escaped immediate capture. From their perspective, the operation had worked, and that success appears to have encouraged an even more ambitious kidnapping. Federal investigators continued studying the Hamm evidence, but the Barker-Karpis Gang remained active. Arthur Barker remained free. Fred Barker remained free. Alvin Karpis remained free. And the gang continued moving between cities, using aliases, changing hideouts, and staying ahead of investigators for the moment. The fingerprints on the ransom material were pieces of a puzzle whose complete picture had not yet emerged, but those pieces would remain in federal files, waiting. Then, less than 7 months after William Hamm was kidnapped, another wealthy businessman disappeared from St. Paul. This time, the victim was Edward G. Bremer, and if the Hamm kidnapping had been ambitious, the Bremer kidnapping would be even more audacious. The ransom demand would double. The investigation would intensify. The evidence would accumulate. And the Barker-Karpis Gang would make mistakes that investigators could not ignore. For Arthur Barker, the walls were beginning to close in. He simply didn't know it yet. January 17th, 1934, St. Paul, Minnesota. 7 months had passed since William Hamm had been kidnapped. The Barker-Karpis Gang had collected an enormous ransom. Hamm had been released alive, and the men responsible remained free. From the gang's perspective, the operation had been a success, and success can create confidence, sometimes too much confidence, because now the gang decided to do it again. Their next target was a wealthy St. Paul banker named Edward G. Bremer, and this time they would demand twice as much money. Edward Bremer belonged to a prominent Minnesota family. His father, Adolf Bremer, was a successful banker and businessman with connections to the brewing industry. The family was wealthy, well-known, and therefore potentially valuable to kidnappers. But Edward Bremer had something else that made his kidnapping especially significant. His family had political connections. Adolf Bremer was acquainted with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. That meant this was not going to remain simply another local crime story. If the kidnappers believed they could repeat the Hamm operation without provoking an even greater response, they were mistaken. On the morning of January 17, Edward Bremer followed a familiar routine. He had taken his young daughter to school. Afterward, he began driving toward his office. Somewhere along the way, his journey was interrupted. The kidnappers had been waiting. Bremer was forced into another vehicle. During the abduction, he was assaulted and injured. We won't dwell on those details. What mattered to investigators was that the kidnapping had not unfolded as cleanly as the criminals may have intended. There had been a struggle. There had been contact. There had been movement between vehicles. And every unexpected complication created opportunities for evidence to be left behind. Bremer disappeared. His automobile did not. When the abandoned vehicle was discovered, authorities immediately understood that something was wrong. Then, the ransom demand arrived. The kidnappers wanted $200,000, an astonishing amount of money, twice the ransom demanded for William Hamm. The message was unmistakable. The men responsible believed they could turn kidnapping into an extraordinarily profitable enterprise. But they were also escalating the stakes. A $200,000 ransom attracted enormous attention. Local authorities became involved. Federal investigators became involved. Newspapers followed developments closely, and the Bremer family entered the same terrifying waiting period the Hamm family had experienced only months earlier. Somewhere, Edward Bremer was being held captive, and nobody outside the gang knew where. The kidnappers moved Bremer away from St. Paul, as they had with Hamm. They attempted to prevent him from learning enough about his surroundings to identify the location later, but a captive does not need to see everything to remember details. Sounds matter, road surfaces matter, the length of a journey matters, changes in direction matter, voices matter, smells matter. Even the rhythm of passing trains or nearby traffic can become useful later. Investigators understood that if Bremer survived, his memories might help reconstruct his captivity for the kidnappers. That made every conversation and every movement a potential mistake. Meanwhile, the ransom negotiations continued. The gang issued instructions designed to prevent police interference. The Bremer family prepared the money. Investigators faced the same dilemma that appears repeatedly in kidnapping cases. They wanted to catch the perpetrators, but their first priority had to be the victim's survival. Move too aggressively, and the kidnappers might panic, wait too long, and evidence could disappear. The result was a tense balance between observation and restraint. The $200,000 ransom was eventually delivered. Then, the waiting continued. For the Bremer family, payment did not immediately bring certainty. They had done what the kidnappers demanded. Now they had to trust that the criminals would keep their promise. Finally, on February 7, 1934, approximately 3 weeks after his disappearance, Edward Bremer was released. He was alive. The immediate crisis was over. But for the Barker-Karpis Gang, the consequences were only beginning. Bremer could now speak to investigators. He could describe what he remembered. Authorities could examine his automobile. They could study the ransom communications. They could trace the money. They could compare evidence from the Bremer kidnapping with evidence from the Hamm kidnapping. And when investigators began doing exactly that, the similarities became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Two wealthy St. Paul businessmen, two kidnappings within months of one another, large ransom demands, victims transported away from the city, carefully controlled communications, and evidence pointing towards the same criminal network. What had initially appeared to be separate crimes was becoming a pattern for federal investigators. Patterns were enormously valuable. A single crime might produce only a handful of clues, but two related crimes could allow evidence to be compared. A technique used once might be coincidence, used twice. It could reveal habit, a particular phrase in a ransom note, a method of delivering instructions, the type of automobile selected, a location used during the crime, a fingerprint, a known associate. Each connection narrowed the field, and once investigators began comparing the two kidnappings, Arthur Barker's name became increasingly important. The ransom money itself offered another investigative opportunity. Before money was delivered in kidnapping cases, authorities could record the serial numbers of the bills. The kidnappers might possess the cash, but spending it created risk. A bill used at a hotel, a store, a service station, or a bank could eventually be recognized as part of the ransom. Then investigators could ask a simple question: who spent it? From there, they could begin reconstructing movements, one transaction at a time. The gang therefore faced an unexpected problem. They had obtained an enormous amount of money, but using it carelessly could expose them. Cash was valuable. Tracked cash could become evidence. Investigators also examined physical evidence associated with the kidnapping. Fingerprints again became important. The Bureau's identification files contained millions of fingerprint records by the early 1930s for criminals who had already served prison sentences. That represented a growing threat. Arthur Barker had spent approximately a decade behind bars. His fingerprints were not unknown. Neither were those of several other members of the criminal network. The men could use false names, but their fingerprints connected their present activities to their past records, and the evidence from the Hamm and Bremer investigations was beginning to create a web that stretched from Minnesota across the Midwest and eventually toward Chicago. But the investigation did not proceed in a straight line. There was no single moment when agents suddenly knew everything. Instead, information accumulated. A name appeared, then another. An associate was identified. A vehicle was connected to someone. A piece of ransom money surfaced. A fingerprint was matched. Someone remembered seeing a suspect. Someone else provided an address. Investigators followed leads that went nowhere. They interviewed people who knew nothing. They watched locations that produced no results. Then, occasionally, one small detail connected to another, and the picture became clearer. This is one reason investigations of organized criminal groups could take so long. The gang was mobile. Its membership changed. Safe houses changed. Cars changed. Names changed. But relationships were harder to change. Arthur Barker was Fred Barker's brother. Fred Barker was closely associated with Alvin Karpis. The men had known other criminals through prisons and previous robberies. Those relationships formed a network, and investigators began mapping it. The Bremer kidnapping also attracted attention from the highest levels of government. President Franklin D. Roosevelt took a personal interest in the case because of his connection to the Bremer family. Federal authorities were under enormous pressure. The gangster era had already produced a series of humiliating episodes for law enforcement. Criminals crossed state lines, escaped local jurisdictions, changed cars, used aliases, and sometimes appeared to move faster than the agencies pursuing them. The federal government wanted to demonstrate that this new generation of interstate criminals could be caught. The Barker-Karpis Gang was becoming a perfect test. Meanwhile, Arthur Barker continued moving. For much of his criminal life, Mobility had protected him. A man wanted in one state could appear under another name somewhere else. Hotels and rented apartments provided temporary shelter. Criminal associates provided introductions. Cash reduced the need for formal records. But every movement created another possibility of recognition. And by late 1934, the investigation was beginning to accelerate. Authorities had evidence connecting Arthur to the kidnapping network. They knew his criminal history. They knew his family. They knew many of his associates. What they did not yet have was Arthur himself. Then, in January of 1935, investigators received information that Arthur Barker might be in Chicago. For years, Doc Barker had moved through a criminal world built around mobility. Now, that mobility had brought him to one of America's largest cities. Agents began watching. They had photographs. They had fingerprints. They had descriptions. And this time, they knew who they were looking for. On January 8, 1935, Arthur Barker's luck finally ran out. Federal agents arrested him in Chicago after years of robberies, prisons, associations with some of America's most notorious criminals, and 2 major kidnapping investigations. Doc Barker was finally in federal custody, but the arrest produced something investigators had not expected. Among Arthur's possessions, they found information that pointed toward another location, a quiet house, far from Minnesota, far from Chicago, in a small community in Florida. Investigators followed the lead, and there, they would find Arthur's younger brother Fred, along with their mother, Kate Barker. 8 days after Arthur's arrest, federal agents surrounded that house, and the Barker family story changed forever. Arthur Barker was now behind bars. Fred Barker and Ma Barker were about to become part of one of the most famous episodes in FBI history. Alvin Karpis was still free, and the Barker-Karpis Gang was beginning to collapse. But Arthur's story was nowhere near finished, because federal prosecutors still had to prove their case. And eventually, Arthur Barker would be sent somewhere very different from every prison he had known before. A place deliberately chosen for prisoners, considered difficult, dangerous, and likely to escape. An island in San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz, January 8, 1935, Chicago, Illinois. For months, federal investigators had been assembling the pieces: fingerprints, ransom money, aliases, automobiles, addresses, associates. Information gathered in one city was compared with evidence recovered in another, and slowly, the enormous network surrounding the Barker-Karpis Gang was becoming visible. Arthur Barker had spent years moving through that network. He had been arrested before. He had been imprisoned before. And each time, eventually, he had returned to the outside world. But this arrest would be different. This time, federal investigators believed they could connect him to one of the most notorious kidnapping operations in the country. And this time, Arthur Barker would never truly be free again. By January of 1935, Chicago was an obvious place for a fugitive to disappear. It was enormous, crowded, busy. Thousands of strangers arrived and departed every day. Railroad stations connected the city with nearly every major region of the country. Hotels and apartment buildings offered anonymity. A person with cash and a false name could disappear into a neighborhood where nobody knew his past. But anonymity had limits. Federal investigators were looking specifically for Arthur Barker. They knew his appearance, they knew his criminal record, and most importantly, they had his fingerprints. An alias could fool a hotel clerk. It could fool a landlord. It might even fool a police officer during a brief encounter. But it could not change the pattern on Arthur Barker's fingertips. On January 8th, federal agents located him. Arthur was arrested in Chicago. The capture itself lacked the spectacular drama that newspapers often associated with Depression-era gangsters. There was no prolonged chase across the city, no legendary escape, no last-minute disappearance. After years spent slipping between jurisdictions, Arthur Barker was simply caught. But the importance of the arrest extended far beyond the man agents had taken into custody, because investigators searched what Arthur had with him and among his possessions. They found something extraordinarily useful, a map. On that map, investigators discovered information that directed their attention toward a place hundreds of miles to the south, Florida. A map can seem like an ordinary possession. For someone constantly traveling, it would hardly be unusual, but investigators were not interested merely in where Arthur had been. They wanted to know where the rest of the Barker-Karpis network might be hiding. The information recovered after Arthur's arrest pointed toward the area around Lake Weir, Florida. That immediately mattered. Arthur's brother Fred was still wanted. So was Alvin Karpis. And Kate Barker, Arthur and Fred's mother, was known to remain close to her sons. Federal agents followed the lead. What had begun with an arrest in a cold northern city now shifted more than 1,000 miles south to Central Florida. Lake Weir was almost the opposite of Chicago, quiet, warm, rural. The lake was surrounded by trees, cottages, and small communities. It was the kind of place where someone might imagine disappearing from national attention. A rented house could look like nothing more than a winter retreat. Neighbors might see unfamiliar residents, but unfamiliar residents were not necessarily suspicious. Florida already attracted visitors escaping northern winters for fugitives. That anonymity could be useful, but once investigators knew where to look, the isolation that had provided protection could become a trap. Agents began searching the area. Eventually, their attention settled on a house near the lake. Inside were two members of the Barker family, Fred Barker and his mother, Kate, Ma Barker. Arthur was already in custody. Now, his arrest had helped investigators locate another part of the family, but one major figure remained missing, Alvin Karpis. 8 days after Arthur's arrest, federal agents surrounded the Florida house. It was January 16th, 1935. The confrontation that followed would become one of the most famous events associated with the Barker name. Federal agents attempted to take those inside into custody. Instead, a prolonged exchange of gunfire followed. Eventually, the house fell silent. When agents entered, Fred Barker and Kate Barker were dead. The event immediately became national news, but the story that emerged afterward was larger than the events inside that house. Federal authorities portrayed Kate Barker as a central figure in the criminal organization. Newspapers embraced the image. Ma Barker, the criminal matriarch, the mastermind, the mother supposedly directing a gang of kidnappers and bank robbers. It was an extraordinary story, and it became part of American folklore But as we explored in our previous episode, the historical evidence for Ma Barker's role as the mastermind of the gang is disputed. Alvin Karpis would later reject that portrayal. Other accounts have similarly questioned how involved Kate was in planning the gang's crimes. There is no serious question that she traveled with her sons, stayed in their hideouts, and lived in close proximity to their criminal world. But proximity is not necessarily leadership. The difference between those two things would become increasingly blurred in popular retellings. And because Kate Barker did not survive the Florida confrontation, she could never provide her own account. For Arthur, the news must have carried an extraordinary weight. Within 8 days, his circumstances had changed completely. He had been captured. His brother Fred was dead. His mother was dead. The gang with which his family had become associated was collapsing, and federal prosecutors were preparing a case that could keep Arthur imprisoned for the rest of his life. But there was another consequence. Arthur's arrest demonstrated something that criminals of his generation had increasingly begun to discover. The country was becoming harder to disappear into. Only a generation earlier, a criminal could sometimes escape simply by crossing a county line. Local police departments maintained their own records. Communication was slow. Information could remain trapped within individual jurisdictions. But the world Arthur Barker inhabited was changing. Federal investigators could compare fingerprints collected in different states. They could trace ransom money. They could circulate photographs nationally. They could follow interstate movements. And increasingly, they could coordinate investigations involving crimes committed hundreds of miles apart. The same automobile that allowed criminals to move quickly allowed investigators to travel quickly. The same telephone networks that connected distant cities allowed police agencies to communicate. The same newspapers that helped make gangsters famous could also distribute their faces across the country. Technology had initially given criminals an advantage. Now, it was beginning to give investigators one too. Arthur Barker had lived through both sides of that transformation. Still, the Barker-Karpis Gang was not finished. One man remained free, Alvin Karpis. His ability to avoid capture became increasingly embarrassing for federal authorities. The gang had been shattered. Arthur was in custody. Fred was dead. Several associates had been identified or arrested. Yet Karpis continued moving. For more than a year after Arthur's capture, he remained at large. His name appeared on wanted notices. His photograph circulated. Federal agents followed leads across the country, and the pursuit became increasingly personal for the Bureau. Eventually, Karpis would be captured in New Orleans in May of 1936. But by then, Arthur Barker's fate had already been decided. Arthur faced federal prosecution for his role in the Bremer kidnapping. The government possessed something prosecutors decades earlier could only have dreamed of: a growing body of forensic evidence, fingerprints, connections between known associates, records of movements, evidence associated with ransom money, and information gathered across multiple jurisdictions. The criminal world Arthur had entered as a young man was confronting a much more sophisticated investigative system. Arthur was convicted. The sentence was severe: life imprisonment. Once again, Arthur Barker faced the possibility that he would never leave prison. He had received a life sentence once before, and somehow, years later, he had returned to freedom. Perhaps that experience shaped the way he thought about imprisonment. Perhaps a life sentence did not feel as permanent to Arthur Barker as it would have to someone else. We cannot know, but we do know what happened next. Federal authorities had to decide where to put him, and ordinary imprisonment was no longer considered sufficient for certain offenders. The government had recently opened a new federal penitentiary. Its location had been selected partly because escape seemed almost impossible. The prison stood on a rocky island surrounded by cold water in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Its name was Alcatraz. Arthur Barker was transferred into federal custody. Eventually, he was sent west. The landscape changed as the journey continued. The cities and plains of the Midwest disappeared behind him. And somewhere ahead, beyond the California shoreline, was a small island. Alcatraz had opened as a federal penitentiary in 1934. It was designed for prisoners who created problems elsewhere, men considered especially dangerous, men with influence over other inmates, men with histories of escape, men federal authorities wanted removed from ordinary prison populations. The institution was deliberately austere. Privileges were limited. Contact with the outside world was restricted. Security dominated daily life, and the water surrounding the island provided a natural barrier beyond the walls. Arthur Barker arrived there as an inmate. His criminal career on the outside was over, or so authorities believed. Imagine the first view: San Francisco Bay, cold gray water, fog moving across the surface. Then, the island, concrete buildings rising above rock, guard towers, fences, walls. There were no highways leading away, no stolen automobiles waiting around the corner, no state boundary to cross, no safe house several hours away. Even if a prisoner escaped the building, he still had to escape the island. For a man whose criminal life had depended so heavily upon movement, Alcatraz represented the opposite: stillness, routine, control. Arthur Barker had spent much of his adult life moving between cities, prisons, hideouts, and highways. Now, his world had been reduced to a cell, but Arthur had escaped the apparent permanence of a life sentence once before. And as the years passed on Alcatraz, the idea of escape would return, quietly, secretly, among a small group of prisoners who began studying the prison around them, its routines, its weaknesses, its barriers, and the water beyond. Eventually, they developed a plan that would bring us back to where this story began. January 13th, 1939, before dawn. 5 prisoners, a fog-covered island, and Arthur "Doc" Barker, preparing to make one final attempt at freedom. San Francisco Bay, 1935. After years spent moving from one place to another, Arthur Barker had finally arrived, somewhere specifically designed to make movement impossible: Alcatraz. The island had served military purposes for decades before becoming a federal penitentiary in August of 1934. Its new mission was unusually specific. Alcatraz was not intended simply to hold prisoners. It was intended to hold prisoners who had proved especially troublesome elsewhere: escape risks, influential criminals, men who violated prison rules, men whose reputations gave them power over other inmates, and some of the most recognizable criminals in America. Federal officials wanted a prison where those men could be isolated, controlled, and largely forgotten. The location seemed perfect. A rocky island sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by cold water, strong currents, and enough distance from shore to make escape appear hopeless. The government had created a prison within a prison. And in 1935, Arthur Doc Barker became one of its inmates. For prisoners arriving by boat, Alcatraz must have presented an extraordinary sight. San Francisco was visible nearby. That was part of the cruelty of the place. Civilization was not hundreds of miles away. It was right there, across the water, buildings, cars, restaurants, families, ordinary people going about ordinary lives. At night, prisoners could sometimes see the lights of the city. On certain occasions, sounds from across the bay could even drift toward the island. Freedom was visible, but unreachable. Between the prisoners and San Francisco stood the bay. The water was cold. The currents could be powerful, and anyone attempting to swim would face exhaustion and exposure long before reaching shore. Even if a prisoner somehow escaped the cell house, the island itself remained another prison wall. Arthur Barker arrived with a reputation. Federal officials knew exactly who he was. He was not simply another bank robber. He was associated with the Barker-Karpis Gang. He had been convicted in connection with the Bremer kidnapping. His criminal record stretched back decades. He had previously received a life sentence and later returned to freedom. From the government's perspective, Arthur was precisely the kind of prisoner Alcatraz had been created to contain. There would be no easy parole, no friendly criminal network waiting outside the gate, no automobile parked nearby, no highway leading out of town at Alcatraz. There wasn't even a road leading off the island. Life inside Alcatraz was deliberately repetitive. Wake, count, breakfast, work, count again, meals, more counts. Return to the cell, lights out, day after day. The routine was not accidental. Predictability allowed guards to notice anything unusual. If one prisoner stood where he normally did not, someone might notice. If a tool disappeared, someone might notice. If a man returned late from an assignment, someone might notice. If a cell looked different, someone might notice. For prisoners thinking about escape, routine was both an obstacle and an opportunity, because if you studied a routine long enough, you could begin to understand it. When guards passed, where they looked, how long they remained, which doors opened, which doors remained locked, where tools were stored, which areas were visible from towers, and which, perhaps, were not. The cells themselves offered little privacy. Arthur's world had become remarkably small. A narrow bed, a sink, a toilet, a few personal belongings, steel bars, concrete. Noise traveled easily. Footsteps echoed, keys rattled, doors slammed, voices carried. The environment constantly reminded prisoners that nearly every aspect of their lives was controlled by someone else. Letters were restricted, visits were limited. Contact with the outside world was carefully monitored. The glamorous image newspapers had created around Depression-era gangsters had little meaning here. Inside Alcatraz, Arthur Barker was not Doc, the notorious gangster. He was an inmate, a number, a man expected to follow the same rules as everyone else. Arthur was hardly the only famous prisoner on the island. Alcatraz became home to an extraordinary collection of men whose names had appeared repeatedly in newspapers. Al Capone spent years there. George Machine Gun Kelly was imprisoned there. Eventually, Alvin Karpis would arrive as well. The criminal world Arthur had known outside prison had not completely disappeared. Pieces of it had simply been relocated behind bars. But Alcatraz authorities understood the danger of allowing powerful inmates to recreate their old organizations inside the prison. Communication was monitored, movement was restricted. Prisoners could not simply gather wherever they wished. The institution was designed to weaken the influence that prominent criminals sometimes exercised in ordinary prisons. Still, men talked during work, during recreation, during meals when conversation was permitted. Small relationships formed, trust developed slowly, and among prisoners serving extremely long sentences. One subject inevitably surfaced: escape. The official position was simple: Alcatraz was escape resistant, perhaps escape proof. But prisoners didn't necessarily accept that. They could see San Francisco. They could see boats crossing the bay. They could watch fog settle over the island. They could observe the tides, and they could study the prison itself. Every wall had been built by people. Every lock had been designed by people. Every security procedure had been created by people, and anything created by people could contain a mistake. That did not mean escape was realistic. It meant prisoners could imagine it. Arthur Barker had a particularly important reason not to dismiss the idea. He was serving a life sentence. There was no date circled on a calendar when he could expect to walk through the gates. No approaching year when freedom would automatically return. Without some extraordinary change, Alcatraz could be his home for the rest of his life. Under those circumstances, even a terrible escape plan could begin to look attractive. By 1938, Arthur had been on the island for several years. He knew the rhythms of the institution, and he was not alone in thinking about escape. 4 other prisoners would eventually join him: Dale Stamphill, William Martin, Henry Young, and Rufus McCain. 5 men, different histories, different personalities, but one shared objective: get off the island. Their opportunity centered on work assignments. Alcatraz prisoners performed various jobs necessary to keep the institution functioning: laundry, kitchen work, maintenance, industrial work. These assignments created something a cell did not: access. Access to rooms, access to equipment, access to tools, and sometimes access to parts of the island that prisoners normally could not approach. The 5 men began examining the possibilities around the Model Industries building, located near the water. The building contained workshops where prisoners worked. If they could get out of the building, they would be closer to the shoreline, and once they reached the shoreline, only the bay would remain. Only, of course, was doing a tremendous amount of work. The water surrounding Alcatraz was one of the prison's greatest defenses. January water temperatures in San Francisco Bay were dangerously cold. Even a strong swimmer could quickly become exhausted. Currents complicated navigation. Fog could make it difficult to determine direction, and the distance that looked manageable from a window could feel very different once a person entered the water. But the prisoners knew something else. The water did not have locks. It did not have bars. It did not carry a rifle. If they could reach it, there was at least a possibility, and for a man serving life, possibility could be enough. Escape plans inside prisons depend upon secrecy. A single careless conversation can destroy months of preparation. A prisoner seeking favor with guards might report what he heard. Another inmate might accidentally reveal something. A missing object might trigger a search. So the men had to proceed carefully. They watched. They waited. they studied. They identified a window in the industries building that might provide a route outside, but reaching a window and getting through it were two different problems. The security bars stood between them and freedom. Those bars would have to be dealt with quietly, without attracting attention, and without leaving obvious evidence that guards might discover during routine inspections. The men began working on the bars, not dramatically, not all at once, slowly, patiently, the kind of work that could be concealed, a little progress, then stop, wait, continue another time. The escape depended upon the most valuable resource prisoners possessed, time. They had plenty of it. The guards, meanwhile, had to be vigilant every day. The prisoners only needed the guards to miss something once. But removing a barrier was only part of the problem. There were 5 men. All 5 had to move through the opening. They had to leave the building. They had to reach the shoreline. They had to avoid detection. And then, somehow, they had to cross the bay. Every additional person increased the possibility that something would go wrong. Yet attempting the escape together offered advantages. They could help one another, share information, divide preparation, and once outside, potentially assist anyone struggling to reach the water. The plan continued developing. Then came January of 1939. Winter on San Francisco Bay. Cold, wet, foggy. Not the conditions most people would choose for entering the water, but bad weather offered one potential advantage: visibility. Fog could hide movement. Darkness could hide movement. Rain could hide sound. The same weather that made the bay more dangerous could make the island easier to leave unseen. It was a terrible calculation, but prison escapes are often built around terrible calculations. Stay and face years or decades behind bars, or attempt something extraordinarily dangerous for the possibility of freedom. Arthur Barker chose the second. January 12th became January 13th. The island settled into darkness. Guards followed familiar routines. Prisoners returned to cells and work areas according to established schedules. San Francisco glowed across the water, and 5 men knew their moment had arrived. Arthur Barker, Dale Stampill, William Martin, Henry Young, Rufus McCain. They had studied the building. They had worked on the bars. They had watched the guards. Now, there would be no more preparation, only execution, sometime in the early hours. The 5 prisoners made their move. They reached the window. The weakened bars gave way, one by one. The men climbed through. For the first time since arriving at Alcatraz, Arthur Barker stood outside the prison building without permission, but he was not free, not yet. Ahead of him lay the shoreline. Beyond that, cold black water, and beyond the water, the distant lights of the mainland. For a few extraordinary moments, the escape plan appeared to be working. 5 prisoners had done something the institution was specifically designed to prevent. They were outside. Then, something changed. A guard noticed movement. An alarm was raised. Searchlights began sweeping across the darkness. And suddenly, Arthur Barker and the other men were no longer escaping unnoticed. They were running out of time. This is where we'll leave them. On the island, outside the building, with the alarm spreading through Alcatraz, the bay directly ahead, and guards closing in behind them. The escape that opened our story had finally begun. January 13th, 1939, Alcatraz Island, before dawn. 5 prisoners were outside the Model Industries building. For the first time, the walls of the prison were behind them. Arthur Barker, Dale Stamphill, William Martin, Henry Young, Rufus McCain. For weeks, perhaps longer, they had prepared for this moment. They had studied the building, watched the guards, worked on the bars covering a window, waited for darkness, and now they had accomplished the first part of their plan. They were outside. But escaping a building on Alcatraz was not the same as escaping Alcatraz. The island itself remained, and beyond it, the bay. The darkness offered protection, so did the fog. January mornings on San Francisco Bay could be bitterly cold. Moisture hung in the air. Visibility changed constantly. The lights of the mainland shimmered faintly across the water. To the 5 men, those lights represented something almost impossible to imagine after years behind bars, streets, automobiles, restaurants, railroad stations, crowds, places where a man might disappear. Freedom was close enough to see. But between Arthur Barker and those lights stood the most formidable barrier of all: cold water. The prisoners moved away from the building. Their objective was the shoreline. If they could reach it unseen, they might have a chance to enter the bay before guards realized what had happened. Exactly what they intended to do after reaching the water has been described differently in accounts of the escape. What is clear is that they needed to get off the island quickly. Once guards discovered the damaged window, Alcatraz could be locked down. Searchlights could illuminate the shoreline. Boats could patrol the surrounding water, and authorities on the mainland could be alerted. Every minute mattered. Then, the escape began to unravel. A guard discovered that something was wrong. The alarm spread. The quiet island changed instantly. Searchlights swept across the darkness. Officers began searching the grounds. The 5 men who had spent so long trying to avoid attention were now the focus of the entire institution. Their carefully prepared escape had become a race. The prisoners continued toward the water, but reaching the shoreline didn't mean safety. Quite the opposite. There were fewer places to hide. The open ground made movement easier to see, and once the alarm had been raised, guards knew exactly what the prisoners ultimately needed to reach: the bay. Arthur and the others were trapped between 2 worlds. Behind them, the prison. Ahead, water that might be almost as dangerous. There was no automobile waiting, no accomplice parked beside a country road, no safe house nearby, no state line to cross. This was not the world of the Barker-Karpis Gang. On Alcatraz, escape depended almost entirely on what the prisoners themselves could accomplish. Authorities ordered the men to stop. The escapees did not immediately surrender. Warning shots were fired. The situation escalated. Dale Stamphill was struck and wounded. Arthur Barker continued attempting to get away. Then, Arthur was shot. The escape attempt was over. He was taken into custody alive, but his injuries were serious. Later that day, Arthur Doc Barker died. He was 39 years old. For a man who had spent so much of his life moving, the end had come on an island barely more than 20 acres in size. He had crossed states, used aliases, survived prisons, joined one of America's most notorious criminal organizations, participated in crimes that brought federal investigators across the country, received a life sentence, returned to freedom, received another life sentence, and finally tried to escape the prison designed specifically for men like him. He never reached the mainland. The remaining escapees survived. Dale Stamphill recovered from his injuries. William Martin, Henry Young, and Rufus McCain remain prisoners. But the story did not end there, because two names from the escape would soon become connected to another disturbing chapter in Alcatraz history: Henry Young and Rufus McCain. The two men had participated in the same escape attempt. They had shared the same objective. They had faced the same danger. But whatever relationship existed between them deteriorated afterward. In December of 1940, Young attacked McCain inside the prison. McCain died. The case later became famous in its own right, particularly because of questions surrounding Young's treatment at Alcatraz and the conditions of his confinement. Decades later, a highly fictionalized version of those events would inspire the film Murder in the First. Arthur Barker never saw any of it. His story had ended nearly 2 years earlier, on the shoreline of Alcatraz, from the prison administration's perspective. The January 1939 attempt demonstrated both the strength and the vulnerability of Alcatraz. The prisoners had not escaped the island. In that sense, the security system had worked, but 5 inmates had successfully breached the industries building. They had removed themselves from an area where guards expected them to remain. They had reached the exterior, and they had come close enough to the shoreline that the bay itself became part of the pursuit. That mattered, because the mythology surrounding Alcatraz depended partly on the idea that escape was impossible. Yet prisoners kept testing that claim. Some plans ended before anyone left a cell. Others reached rooftops, fences, work areas, or the shoreline. And eventually, one escape attempt would become so famous that people still debate its outcome today. But that was decades away. In January 1939, Arthur Barker's attempt became one of the prison's earliest major escape incidents. There was something almost cruelly psychological about the geography of Alcatraz. If Arthur had been imprisoned hundreds of miles from civilization, freedom might have felt abstract. Instead, San Francisco was visible every day. The mainland remained on the horizon. Boats crossed the bay. People lived ordinary lives just beyond the water. The prisoners could see the world continuing without them. For a man serving life, that proximity may have made freedom seem both impossible and irresistible. Arthur Barker had spent much of his criminal career exploiting distance, crossing county lines, crossing state lines, moving from one hideout to another. At Alcatraz, distance finally worked against him. A relatively short stretch of water was enough. Newspapers reported Arthur Barker's death to the public. He was already part of a fading era. By 1939, the great crime wave that had dominated headlines earlier in the decade was largely over. John Dillinger was dead. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were dead. Charles Pretty Boy Floyd was dead. George Babyface Nelson was dead. Fred Barker was dead. Ma Barker was dead. Alvin Karpis had been captured. The federal government had dramatically expanded its ability to pursue interstate criminals. The world that had allowed gangs like Barker-Karpis to move rapidly between jurisdictions was disappearing. Arthur Barker's death at Alcatraz felt almost like an epilogue to that period. The gangster era had promised movement, speed, automobiles, highways, escape. Arthur's story ended in the one place where none of those things could help him: an island. But there is another reason Arthur Barker's story deserves to be remembered. Popular history tends to compress the Barker family into a single image: Ma Barker and her boys. a criminal mother, her criminal sons, a notorious gang. But when we separate those people, their individual stories become much more complicated. Arthur's life stretched across several distinct eras of American crime. He began offending before Prohibition. He spent much of the 1920s imprisoned. He emerged into the Depression-era crime wave. He became associated with sophisticated kidnapping operations. He was identified through evolving forensic techniques. He was pursued by a rapidly modernizing federal law enforcement system, and he ended his life inside America's most famous experiment in maximum security imprisonment. Arthur Barker's biography is therefore more than the story of one gangster. It is also, in a strange way, a history of how American crime and law enforcement changed during the first 4 decades of the 20th century. And yet, one question remains. What became of the organization Arthur Barker had once belonged to? Fred was gone. Arthur was gone. Ma Barker was gone. Many associates were imprisoned, but Alvin Karpis survived. In fact, Karpis would eventually arrive at Alcatraz himself. And unlike Arthur, he would live long enough to tell his version of what had happened. His memories would help fuel the debate surrounding Ma Barker. They would provide a criminal's perspective on the gang, and they would contribute to the complicated legacy Arthur Barker left behind. So, before we close this story, there is one final chapter, not about Arthur Barker's crimes, not about his escape, but about what remained. After Arthur Doc Barker was gone, January 13, 1939, Arthur Doc Barker was dead. He had spent nearly 40 years moving through an America that had changed almost beyond recognition during his lifetime. When Arthur was born, the automobile was still a novelty. Air travel barely existed. Radio had not yet entered American homes. Federal law enforcement possessed nothing resembling the reach it would develop during the 1930s. By the time Arthur died, cars crossed states in hours. Radio carried news across the country almost instantly. Fingerprints could connect a suspect to crimes committed hundreds of miles apart. Federal agents pursued fugitives across state boundaries, and an entirely new kind of maximum security prison stood on an island in San Francisco Bay. Arthur Barker had lived through that transformation, and in a strange way, his criminal career reflected it. By the time Arthur attempted to escape Alcatraz, the organization with which his name had become associated was already history. Fred Barker was dead. Ma Barker was dead. Arthur was imprisoned. Many associates had been arrested or scattered. And Alvin Karpis, the man who had formed such an effective partnership with Fred Barker, had finally been captured. Karpis remained free longer than most of the gang's major figures. After the Florida confrontation in January 1935, federal agents intensified their efforts to find him. For more than a year, he managed to stay ahead of them. Then, on May 1st, 1936, Karpis was captured in New Orleans. His arrest effectively closed one of the most famous manhunts of the Depression era, and eventually, Karpis was sent to the same place as Arthur, Alcatraz. There is something remarkable about that. Years earlier, Arthur Barker and Alvin Karpis had belonged to a criminal network that crossed state lines. They had moved through cities, hideouts, hotels, and highways. Now both men were confined to the same small island. The federal government had taken criminals, whose greatest advantage had once been mobility, and placed them somewhere movement was almost completely controlled. Karpis would spend far longer at Alcatraz than Arthur. In fact, he would eventually spend more time there than any other prisoner. And unlike Arthur, Karpis lived long enough to tell his story that would become extremely important to the historical reputation of the Barker family, especially the reputation of Ma Barker. When Kate Barker died in Florida, federal authorities portrayed her as an important figure within the gang. The newspapers went further. Before long, Ma Barker had become one of the most recognizable criminal characters of the 20th century. The image was irresistible: an older mother, surrounded by criminal sons, supposedly directing robberies and kidnappings from behind the scenes. Popular culture embraced it: books, movies, television programs, songs, fictional characters. Again and again, Ma Barker appeared as the ruthless matriarch of a criminal dynasty. But Alvin Karpis later challenged that image. According to Karpis, Kate Barker was not the strategist behind the gang's crimes. He described her instead as a mother who traveled with her sons and benefited from their criminal lifestyle, but who was not included in the detailed planning of major operations. That distinction matters because if Karpis was correct, then the popular image of the Barker family has distorted the roles of the people actually making decisions: Fred Barker, Alvin Karpis, Arthur Barker, and the other men involved in particular crimes. The more powerful the Ma Barker legend became, the easier it was for the individual criminal careers of her sons to disappear behind it. Remove Ma Barker from the story for a moment, and Arthur's life looks very different. He was not simply Ma Barker's son. Arthur had an extensive criminal history of his own. He had spent years imprisoned before the Barker-Karpis Gang became nationally notorious. He had been convicted of serious crimes. He associated with experienced criminals. He became connected to one of the most significant kidnapping operations of the Depression era. His fingerprints helped investigators connect him to evidence. He was convicted in federal court. He was sent to Alcatraz, and eventually, he participated in an organized attempt to escape. Arthur did not require a criminal mastermind mother to explain his choices. His own record tells us enough. This is an important distinction when looking at historical crime. Legends tend to simplify. They create heroes, villains, masterminds, sidekicks. But real criminal organizations are rarely that neat. The Barker-Karpis Gang was a network. Different people participated in different operations. Relationships changed. Associates came and went. Information was divided. And the people involved did not necessarily understand their organization in the same way outsiders later described it. Arthur Barker's story reminds us how easily an individual's history can become absorbed into a more famous narrative. Ask many people today about Arthur Barker, and they may not recognize the name. Ask them about Ma Barker, and they may immediately picture a gangster matriarch surrounded by armed sons. Yet Arthur was not merely standing beside history, he was participating in it. Perhaps the most revealing part of Arthur's story is not the Alcatraz escape. It may be something much quieter, a fingerprint. For generations, criminal identification had depended heavily on descriptions: height, weight, hair, scars, photographs, names. But descriptions could be imperfect. Appearance could change. Names could be invented. Documents could be forged. Fingerprints offered something different. Arthur Barker had been arrested repeatedly. That meant law enforcement possessed his prints. When investigators recovered latent fingerprints during the Hamm and Bremer investigations, they could compare those marks against existing records. The crimes were sophisticated. The kidnappers used automobiles, aliases, hideouts, ransom instructions, interstate movement. Yet something as small as the impression left by a fingertip could survive all of that planning. Arthur's story therefore belongs not only to gangster history, but also to the history of forensic science. The Barker-Karpis Gang emerged during an unusual moment. The early years of the Great Depression produced a group of interstate criminals who became national celebrities. Part of that fame came from the crimes themselves, but part came from technology. Newspapers could distribute dramatic stories across the country. Radio could spread news rapidly. Photographs allowed the public to recognize fugitives they had never seen in person. At the same time, automobiles allowed criminals to travel farther and faster than earlier generations. The result was a new kind of outlaw, not merely local, national. A bank robber in Minnesota could become famous in California. A fugitive from Oklahoma could appear in Chicago. A criminal gang could commit crimes across several states, and millions of Americans could follow the pursuit. But the same forces that created the interstate gangster eventually helped destroy him. Federal jurisdiction expanded, communication improved, fingerprint databases grew, agencies shared information more effectively, wanted posters circulated nationally, radio-equipped police cars became increasingly common. The federal government developed specialized agents capable of pursuing criminals across jurisdictions. By the late 1930s, the environment that had allowed the famous Depression-era gangs to flourish was disappearing. Arthur Barker's career sits almost perfectly across that transition. He began in an older world of local policing. He ended inside one of the most famous federal institutions ever created. Arthur's death also became part of the mythology of Alcatraz. The prison operated as a federal penitentiary for less than 3 decades. From 1934 until 1963, yet its reputation became enormous. Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Robert Stroud, Alvin Karpis, and later, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. The names associated with Alcatraz helped transform the island into something larger than a prison. It became a symbol, isolation, control, and the apparently impossible dream of escape. Arthur Barker belongs to that history too. His 1939 attempt came relatively early in the federal prison's existence. 5 men succeeded in getting outside the industry's building. They demonstrated that even Alcatraz contained weaknesses, but they also discovered why escaping the building was only part of the problem. The island remained, the guards remained, and the bay remained. Arthur never made it into the mythology of Alcatraz, quite like some later escapees, perhaps because there was no mystery about his fate. There was no question of whether he secretly reached the mainland. No unexplained disappearance, no decades of speculation. Arthur Barker's story ended on the island, and mysteries often survive longer in popular memory than conclusions. There is another way to understand Arthur's life, through his brothers, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, Fred. All 4 Barker sons encountered serious trouble with the law, yet their lives did not end in the same way. Herman died years before the height of the Barker-Karpis Gang's fame. Fred became one of Alvin Karpis's closest criminal partners and died alongside his mother in Florida. Arthur survived long enough to reach Alcatraz. only to die during an escape attempt. Lloyd lived much longer than his brothers. The four men shared a family, but not a single fate. That alone should make us cautious about reducing their lives to the phrase, Ma Barker's boys. Each made choices, each accumulated his own history, and each became part of the Barker story in a different way. So, after everything we've explored, who was Arthur Barker? He was a career criminal, a convicted kidnapper, a member of the Barker-Karpis criminal network, a repeat prisoner, an Alcatraz inmate, and ultimately an unsuccessful escapee. But he was also a figure who lived at the intersection of several important changes in American history: the rise of the automobile, the growth of interstate crime, the expansion of federal law enforcement, the development of forensic identification, the Depression-era fascination with gangsters, and the creation of Alcatraz as America's most famous maximum security prison. His name never became as famous as his mother's. His criminal partnership never became as famous as Fred Barker and Alvin Karpis. His Alcatraz escape never became as mysterious as the attempt made by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers more than 20 years later. Arthur Barker seems always to stand slightly behind someone else's legend, but follow his life from beginning to end, and an extraordinary story emerges. A young offender enters prison. Years pass. He returns to freedom. He joins a criminal network operating across the Midwest. 2 spectacular kidnappings attract federal attention. A fingerprint helps connect the evidence. Agents close in. Arthur is captured in Chicago. A clue leads investigators toward Florida. His brother and mother die. Arthur is convicted. A second life sentence follows. He is transported west, across the country, across San Francisco Bay, onto an island built to contain men who had escaped every other form of control. Years pass again. Then, before dawn on a cold January morning, Arthur sees one final possibility: a window, a shoreline, fog, and distant lights across the water. He tries to reach them. He never does. Arthur Doc Barker spent much of his life attempting to outrun consequences. In the end, the distance between him and freedom was remarkably small, just a stretch of cold water separating Alcatraz from the lights of San Francisco. And that is where the story of Arthur Doc Barker ends. Thank you for joining me for another episode of ASMR Crime Chronicles. Tonight's story took us from the early criminal career of Arthur Doc Barker, through the rise of the Barker-Karpis Gang, the Hamm and Bremer kidnappings, the growing federal investigation, his capture, and finally, to Alcatraz. If you enjoyed this longer, more detailed format, please let me know in the comments. I've received requests to spend more time exploring these cases, their historical background, and the investigation surrounding them, so I'd love to know if you'd like future episodes to continue in this style. And if you haven't already, please consider liking the video and subscribing to ASMR Crime Chronicles. It truly helps the channel grow and allows me to continue sharing these strange, fascinating, and sometimes forgotten stories from true crime history. If there's a case you'd like to hear covered in a future episode, feel free to leave your suggestion below. Until next time, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening. Good night.